On this day, 10th of February, 1567, the murder of Lord Darnley, the second husband of Mary Queen of Scots, took place in Edinburgh, Scotland. Lord Darnley was hated by all the great lords of Scotland, hated by the great Protestant preacher, John Knox, and hated even by the Queen herself. This has got to be one of history's greatest whodunits. Mary Queen of Scots had a great view of the time in which she lived. 6 days after her birth, her father died and she became queen. Her mother, though, was the regent and ruled Scotland. She was a French princess. And not long after, she was sent to the French court because she was betrothed to a French prince, a son of Catherine de' Medici. In the French court, which was at the time the most sophisticated court in Europe, and she became pretty much a French princess, she would have been tutored by the great Catherine de' Medici herself. And just going on a beeline about Catherine de' Medici, she came from an Italian noble family, the Medicis, in Florence. She married Henry III, I think it was, and became Queen of France. And she bore a number of children for the King of France. And she had herself quite a tragic life. Her husband died, her son became king, and she helped him through that time. He died. Then Francis, Mary's husband, became king. He died a year after he became king. And then her next son became king as well. So pretty much all of her sons became king. Her last son was assassinated about 7 months after she died, or maybe 6 months after she died. So all of her children became king, all of her sons, and they all died. Ended up with a Protestant king becoming King of France, although he famously said, "Paris is worth a mass," so he ditched his Protestantism to become king. That was the first Bourbon king. So Mary was a part of this whole milieu in France at the time. The religious wars, the Huguenots, at one point 25% of the population. There was civil war, religious war. Catherine de' Medici didn't really know what to do. She was soft on them sometimes, hard on them other times. The St. Bartholomew Day massacre was partly blamed on her, and who knows what's going on, because there was various people in the court who hated the Protestants, who liked them, who wanted to be soft, who wanted to compromise. And France did have a history of breaking with Rome when it felt the need to. The whole period when there were two papacies, the Avignon papacy, where France pretty much set up its own Catholic Church on its doorstep. So France had a big history of not actually being terribly loyal to Rome, but Catherine herself was a very faithful Catholic, being from Tuscany, very near Rome, and some of her family had been popes in the past. So she had much stronger connection to the Catholic Church than many people in France did, even the most faithful Catholics. They had very obviously at some points in the past ditched Rome and tried to divide the church. Anyway, so Mary was in this situation in France. Her husband had died, and she was now Queen Dowager. France was a bit of a mess. There was a new king on the throne, there was a new queen, there was the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici herself. They're getting a bit crowded. So Mary decided to go home. So she ends up in Scotland, Now, Scotland at this point would have been quite a step back from the French court. Scotland was cold, it was wet, it was dark, it was incredibly Presbyterian at this point because there had been the Reformation since she'd left. So she was a French Catholic, kind of an easygoing Catholic, coming back to a very sombre and severe Presbyterian Scotland, where things like dancing and music and nice clothes and flirting were looked down upon and condemned, and John Knox regularly condemned the young queen. This poor young woman came into Edinburgh, a dark and dismal place, even now really in some ways, although it's quite beautiful. But when she arrived, it must have been horrendous in many ways. She had been in Paris, she had been in the great courts of that Fontainebleau outside of Paris, that beautiful palaces. The weather was a lot better than up in Edinburgh. But she had to leave France because she had no power there anymore. She would have been shunted aside, but she was a queen in her own right. So she was in Scotland, and she was very young. She was 18, 19. And she decided to be sensible. She wasn't a Catholic fanatic at this point, and she decided to take her Protestant lords and take their advice, and for a time she ruled quite well, because she wasn't a fanatic, because she realised she needed their help, and she was a young girl that wanted to have a nice life. But all of this was about to be overturned. In 1565, Darnley, who had been in the court in London, left for Edinburgh, and he presented himself to Mary at Weymouth Castle near Fife. It is said that Mary liked him a lot, saying that he was the lustiest and best proportioned long man that she had seen. She had the hots for this guy. He was obviously a looker, and very quickly Mary and Lord Darnley had become an item. Now, they had probably been at it before they were officially married, but we're not allowed to talk about Queen in that way, so let's not. However, they got married, and she was pregnant. But very quickly, she ended up hating him. He was a violent drunk. There are rumours that he forced himself on her, and that he was violent towards her. One of her favourites, David Rizzio, an Italian who had been in her service since France, turned up dead in 1566, so a year after she had met him. He had been stabbed 56 times. Now, if you stab someone, if you're trying to kill someone, just get rid of them. You slit their throat, maybe stabbing them back a few times. Stabbing someone 56 times looks to me like a crime of passion. Almost like he was jealous. And there were rumours that this David Rizzio had been intimate with the Queen, but there's also rumours that he had been intimate with Darnley himself, so who the hell knows what was going on there. It's like something like Game of Thrones. And that's the thing about Scottish politics. Right up until it was unified with England, Scotland was like Game of Thrones on steroids. Like, people are getting assassinated left, right, and centre. Kings, queens, everyone. Anyway, so this guy was stabbed 56 times, and Mary was not happy about this. She was pregnant, but she was in mourning because of Rizzio. And everyone obviously pointed immediately to Darnley. And even in England, Lord Cecil, the Queen's first minister, I suppose you call it, the equivalent of the Prime Minister at the time, he wasn't. But he apparently was talking about how Darnley had initiated the murder plot and had got other people to come along with him. So, that's Darnley. He's a bit of a bad egg, but Darnley was a Stuart. So this is the man who gave his name to the great family Stuart, the dynasty that would rule Great Britain and Ireland and the colonies for a century and a half. So, I think it was the historian David Starkey said that the Stuarts were the worst thing to happen to Britain in its long history. The worst family to be in control. That's his view. But, well, a lot of murder, a lot of civil war, a lot of chaos, revolutions. Yeah, maybe there's something to that. Not long after the murder of David Rizzio, the guy stabbed 56 times, because that sort of thing happens in Edinburgh apparently back in the day. Mary gave birth to James, future King of Scotland and England. Now, after this, they christened him as a Catholic apparently, although he was raised as a good Protestant. Scottish Protestant, that what Darnley wanted was a thing called crown matrimonial, which meant that if she died, he would be the heir. You wonder why he'd be asking for that when they've just had a son, and she's young and healthy and fertile, so they could have more kids, obviously, and what's the point of having that? Surely he should be happy with being regent if she happened to die in childbirth or something. It's a bit odd. But already at this point, she had taken a dislike to him. He was insolent, he was a drunk, he was arrogant, violent, vain. So she didn't want to do this. And, well, Darnley died 8 months after James's birth. His body and that of his valet were discovered in Edinburgh, where they'd been staying. They hadn't been staying with the Queen, they'd been staying separately because she hated him. So Darnley had been recovering from smallpox, or some said syphilis. Where did he get syphilis from? Not the Queen, is it? So he had stayed with family in Glasgow until Mary had brought him to recuperate in Edinburgh. A short walk from Holyrood Castle and Palace. So she had been thinking about bringing him back to court again. Probably not because she liked him, but because she thought she had to, because she was married to him. A good Catholic woman. You have to suffer through a lot, especially bad husbands. And about 2 a.m. on the night of the 9th and 10th February 1567, while Mary was away, 2 explosions rocked the area around where Darnley was staying. Later on, they found that 2 barrels of gunpowder had been placed in the small room under Darnley's sleeping quarters. Darnley's body and the body of his valet were found outside, surrounded by a cloak, a dagger, a chair, and a coat. Darnley only had his nightshirt on, and it looked as if Darnley didn't die in the explosion, but had been smothered or strangled. So, a post-mortem revealed internal injuries. John Knox had claimed surgeons were lying and that Darnley had been strangled instead of just suffocated. So there was a bit of an unsure sort of thing about what had happened. But it was quite obvious that he had been murdered. It's almost kind of, well, it's not as bad as the Rasputin thing. An explosion, found outside, smothered or strangled, Queen hated him, the Lords hated him, John Knox hated him. Who did it? Oh my god. Soon after the murder, suspicion fell on a Earl of Bothwell, James Hepburn, and his supporters. Apparently his shoes were found at the scene. How are your shoes at the scene of the death of the consort of the Queen? That's a bit odd, isn't it? However, this Bothwell guy had apparently been intimate with the Queen, or been friendly with the Queen, whatever. And perhaps they had organised something together. However, he then took her from Edinburgh. One theory is he kidnapped her, took her to Dunbar Castle and raped her. Second is that she was a willing participant, and the whole rape thing was a story so her honour and reputation got ruined, because she was supposed to be the grieving widow of the guy who possibly she just killed. And so yes, things get worse for her, because Bothwell was also hugely unpopular, and people didn't like the fact, even though they hated Darnley, hated the Stuart fella, they didn't like the fact that she would just go around and kill someone. Although, did she do it, or was it this Hepburn guy, or what was going on? Again, this is like King's Landing in Game of Thrones. We don't know what the hell's going on, and we still don't really know. There's theories still that she was the one that instigated it, or perhaps she was manipulated by this Hepburn guy, or perhaps she manipulated him, perhaps he was a raper, perhaps wasn't. We don't even know, because we have no documents, we have no evidence, but his shoes were found at the scene, so we know that. He was definitely there, so he's involved in the murder of this Stuart fellow, Darnley. He was involved in that murder. We don't know exactly how, and we don't know if she was involved, or she told him to, or he did it by himself and then told her afterwards. Oh my god, this is crazy. Anyway, so the people... Oh, and there's a guy here, William Blackadder. If you know anything about the Blackadder series, this is brilliant. So, a soldier under the pay of a guy called Bothwell, Captain William Blackadder of the clan Blackadder, was one of the first non-participants to happen upon the scene, so this is the murder. And he was treated as a suspect, and then he was hanged, drawn and quartered before each of his limbs was nailed to the gates of different Scottish towns. Poor Blackadder. I'm sure Edmund Blackadder would not have been so stupid as that. Anyway, so this led eventually to Mary's fall from power, because this was such a scandal, even in Scotland of the day, when Scotland was crazy back then. Scotland was nuts. But even for Scotland, the Queen being involved in adultery murdering her husband, and then allowing an innocent to be hung, drawn, and quartered, even that was too much for them. And they said, this is enough, you've got to abdicate. And she had to abdicate, because this was like Watergate times 100 for Scotland in the day. And she ended up having to flee into England, where she sought protection from Queen Elizabeth I. And we all are aware of what happened at that point. She became Elizabeth's prisoner. Elizabeth didn't want her there, but didn't want to get rid of her, and she was in a bind as well, so she kept her far away from court, up in the north. And when I say prisoner, she stayed with aristocratic families in a nice big house. She was treated very well. It was only later on that she was put in a prison, a proper prison, because she was plotting. But for a good number of years, she was a guest of noble families. She was allowed to do whatever she wanted to do. She could worship as she wanted, because she was a queen. And Elizabeth was kind of she didn't want her there. She was like, what do I do with this woman? But she couldn't do anything, because she was trying to keep Scotland on side as well. And James, who then became king after Mary's forced abdication, this James was Elizabeth's heir. And so it was a very complicated thing going on there. So yeah, on this day, Game of Thrones became real when Darnley Stuart, Lord Darnley Stuart, House of Stuart, was murdered in Edinburgh by who knows who, but it's assumed the Queen, Mary Queen of Scots, had something to do with it, with her lover, who might have been a rapist and kidnapper. We're not quite sure, because we don't know what's going on. And yeah, she had to abdicate because of it. And yeah, it was complicated. On this day, Lord Darnley was murdered, and James Hepburn's shoes were found at the scene. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment, please.